Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. Let's go to the Middle East now, where it's believed that Israel's new government could unveil plans to annex large parts of the West Bank as soon as next month. But the international community has been opposed to this unilateral move that is supported by Washington. The Israeli government could enact legislation to annex the Jordan Valley and other parts of the West Bank, a move that's likely to have huge repercussions in the region. Well, to tell us a little bit more, we're now joined by Palestine's Ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Hana Jarrar. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, my pleasure.
All right, so this must be a concern, of course, for the state of Palestine and Palestinians in the region. Take us through how this annexation plan came about. When was it instituted and enacted? In fact, I think they're trying to enact it now, but how did it come about?
The annexation step, you mean?
Yes.
Well, the annexation step is it's not new. It's the first step in exploring the possibility of implementing the Trump's deal of the century, and it's not new actually, because Israel has been practicing the annexation and the occupying of other lands since 1948 up till this date. What does annexation mean, so that people can understand what we mean when we talk about annexation? It's the expansion of sovereignty of one state on a piece of land for its sake from another state. So basically, this is what Israel is trying to do nowadays, because it announces that it will annex around 30% of the Palestinian land, mainly the Israeli settlement blocks in West Bank and the Jordan Valley, which separates Palestine from Jordan. So basically, we are talking about the annexation of around, or expanding the sovereignty of Israel of around 30% of the lands of the Palestinian state. By this action, Israel is continuing its expansionist colonial project, which started 1948 by occupying Palestine at that time, and continue in 1967 by occupying the rest of the Palestinian land, which constitute West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza.
All right, just to get a sense of what you're saying. So 1947 borders, 44% of the land owned by Palestine, and then 1967 that went down to 22%, and with this annexation plan that would come down to just 15%. Is that the correct maths?
Exactly, yes. In 1948, Israel occupied 78% of the mandatory Palestine. In 1967, which by coincidence, it's today that Palestinians commemorate the 53rd anniversary of Al-Aqsa, which is occupying the 1967 Palestine. And now, by this step of annexation, Israel is trying to annex 30% of the remaining 22% of the Palestinian territory. So basically, yes, what is left is merely less than 15% of the proposed Palestinian state, according to the Oslo Accord.
So with the occupation that's taking place, what happens to the Palestinians that are already there?
You mean the Palestinians in West Bank and in Gaza, or the Palestinians in the proposed annexed areas?
This proposed annexed areas.
Well, Netanyahu announced the other day that Palestinians will stay in their towns, but sovereignty will be granted for Israel. So basically, those Palestinians will be suffocated in small bantustans, exactly like the apartheid system used to do in South Africa. They will be suffocated in small places with small geographical connectivity to other Palestinian land. So basically, what annexation is doing for the proposed state of Palestine is that it destroys any possibility for a viable Palestinian state. It destroys the possibility or the idea of the two-state solution, because there will be no Palestinian state. It would turn the Palestinian communities in cities in West Bank and Gaza into small Bantustans that's surrounded by a sea of Israelis. On the other hand, because they will annex the Jordan Valley, it means that Palestine will have no access to the outside world, because it will block their main border with Jordan, which is the one and the only border to the world outside. And also there is another kind of challenge that because the annexation of the Jordan Valley means the annexation of around 50% of the farming or agricultural lands for Palestine, because the Jordan Valley constitutes the food basket for the Palestinian territory. And it also a huge loss of water resources, mineral resources, because we will be denied access to the Dead Sea, which contains many resources. And of course, it will mean the loss of a huge economic income for the Palestinian people in that area.
What have the Israeli authorities said to justify this annexation? What's the story that they've been putting forward?
There is no story to be justified, because according to international humanitarian law and according to the United Nations Charter, annexation of others' lands by force is absolutely prohibited. And this step is a strong violation for all these international humanitarian laws in force. So Israel is not trying to justify its step, because simply they consider that the Palestinian land is their land, and that's why they started, even after the peace process took place in 1994, they started and continue constructing Israeli settlements inside the lands of the Palestinian state. That's why they don't give any kind of justification. They do believe that these settlement blocks should belong to the Israeli sovereignty, and they have the right to annex whatever land that they deem appropriate. And unfortunately, the United States is backing them, and it was stated also in the deal of the century. So they believe that this action is justifiable, because it just has been said in the ultimate deal of the century that was proposed in January this year.
All right, so you've been talking about it as you've been answering my questions, but this two-state solution then becomes almost impossible under these new circumstances.
Yes, of course, because if the annexation took place, there are a huge international rejection for this Israeli step, and there is a huge pressure that has been practiced over Israel from the international community and from the EU, from different states, to not proceed forward in doing this step of annexation. But in case it took place, it will be a catastrophe, because it will destroy any possibility for a viable Palestinian state, and it will destroy the formula of the two-state solution that has been until now the only formula backed by the international community.
So what would you like to see happening, and what is your call to the international community?
Well, our call to the international community is that you should stand up for your principles. You should stand up for the UN Charter. You should stand for the international humanitarian law and hold Israel accountable for its aggression and for its violation of all these treaties and charters. The international community has been giving statements 50 years ago, and now on they still do the same thing. I think no, it's time for action, because annexation is not only extending sovereignty of a piece of land for the sake of another country. It's an existential threat for the Palestinian existence and for the Palestinian identity, because Palestinians will refuse to live on the leftovers. Palestinians will not live into small bantustans or ghettos and let them suffocating with the aim or the ultimate objective of practicing silent transfer against them. I think the international community at some point stood up with South Africa against the aggression, and they use methods and mechanisms that really brought the apartheid into an end. And I think that the international community shall need to support us exactly as they did with South Africa a long time ago, and really was very concrete and brought the apartheid into an end. We need actions that really bring the Israeli occupation into an end.
All right, you've talked about South Africa, and a little bit earlier on you compared to the situation for Palestinians almost similar to the Bantustans that we had here in South Africa. Just tell us, how difficult is it for Palestinians who are living in West Bank and Gaza to do ordinary things like travel and visit relatives in other parts of the Palestinian state?
Well, it's very difficult because unfortunately Israel has worked systematically since signing the Oslo and the peace agreement in 1994 to just cut the relations between slowly but surely between the Palestinian cities. And now, by this step of annexation, it tries again to suffocate Palestinians and put them into small gatherings or small communities with no geographical connectivity. Sometimes you have to use alternative roads because the settlement blocks are like mishmash, turning the area into like a Swiss cheese with different holes. So sometimes you can't use the normal roads. You have to use alternative roads. You have no access to your natural resources. You have no access to medical facilities, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was very hard for people to move around and to move from one place into another. Of course, taking into consideration that the geographical connectivity between Gaza and West Bank has been blocked long time ago. Gaza is under siege for 13 consecutive years now, witnessing 3 or 4 wars against it, leaving it as a rubble or without any humanitarian aid coming in. The situation is very difficult, and unfortunately, it's getting worse and worse, taking into consideration the measures that has been taken now by the Israeli government. Unfortunately, we are turning into a system of apartheid, and I'm sure that the people of South Africa knows what apartheid means. It means lack of movement. It means restrictions of movement for people or goods. It means the discrimination. It means inequality. It means aggression. The situation is becoming harder and harder, and we hope that the international community will move to help Palestinians and to salvage the two-state solution, because they have been doing so for long, but only through statements. Now I think it's time for actions.
All right, and that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts about the situation in Palestine and this proposed annexation by Israel. Thanks so much indeed for your time, Ambassador.